Welcome back, everybody, to PK Woodworking. I know I've been gone a bit, but this is the reason. I was doing a project that was a set of cutting boards for presents for Christmas. And so I couldn't post any of the information. I couldn't show it off. Otherwise, people would obviously know what they were going to be getting. So I'm going to kind of track through this in, unfortunately, time lapse because it did take quite some time. You'll see many costume changes during this. And most of this was based on MTM Woods. If you want to look up MTM Wood on YouTube, he has a lot of amazing projects he's built with cutting boards. And so I used one of his plans to build these and learned a lot from it because there's definitely things that aren't in the plans that I think next time I made these would make things a little easier. Long story short is I'm doing a lot of milling on my Felder 8941. It's definitely come through for me when it comes to processing all of this lumber. All of these needed to be at specific thicknesses. It wasn't something where you could just get the wood, to a place where they were smooth and then you could glue up. They had to be specific. And so there's lots of me going back and forth to get specific different pieces of wood to different thicknesses. So I'm going to let you watch that for a little bit. And when I get to something that makes sense, I'll tell you more a little bit about what's going on. As you can probably see to your left there, I have a new toy. I don't know if I'd call it a toy, but it's a new tool that I've got. It's a Format 4 Kappa 400 X Motion sliding table saw. And it came in handy for this project for sure because some of the parts that I'm going to do later really being able to use a sliding table saw with a huge slider like that makes things easy. So anyways, I'm processing a lot of the wood that has to go to specific widths now for glue up. So I'm doing more processing of two different parts. So through this, if you wanted to spend some time on that MTM Wood site, you basically have to make two different sets of cutting boards to begin with. You cut them down and have to re-glue in certain orders. So I'm pretty much done now with the basic milling for the stuff for my first glue up. The first glue up is some sapele with a maple piece on top of it. So you first have to glue up the sapele to get the sapele surfaced and planed. And then you do the same thing with these maple pieces that I'm putting together. And after you get them glued, you can sandwich them together. I've got them sandwiched now. And then you have to go through and cut through all those pieces down to a 45-degree angle. After you've got them cut to 45-degree angle, then you have to flatten them out, which I'm doing right now, individually on the planer. And then you're going to come back after that and go back to the table saw and have to cut off the tips on each side of each one of those pieces that are left after you cut them on the table saw at a 45-degree angle to get that 3D effect that happens on these cutting boards that I'm building. So this is me slicing off those little tips to make them into square pieces again before the next glue up. As you're going to see, a lot of gluing happening in this particular project. I used Titebond 3 and I went through a gallon of Titebond 3. Yes, a gallon of Titebond 3 to do this. And again, there's going to be a lot of glue up, so I'm just going to kind of let this go for a second while the glue up happens. I got pretty good at switching over the joiner planer over time. Now each one of those individual pieces I glued up needs to be trued up, jointed and planed again to be completely square. These cutting boards that have this 3D effect do not work well unless each one of these pieces are exactly the dimension you say they are. When you go to glue them up at the end, if they don't all true up, it won't give you that same 3D effect. And then Matt's in the background beginning to put up the Christmas lights. So got that going on at the same time. Uh, again, this is a lot of measuring and checking, and then the next glue up. So glue up number 2. Now I think we're getting to the point where I'm starting to get some of these glue ups that are going to start to, I don't know, make more sense. But again, individual pieces to be glued up to get these longer, wider boards to cut up. I had one piece unfortunately kind of fail, so I went back and used the table saw to build another piece and then get me back to being able to glue all these back up. But beautiful part of being able to dial in a dimension versus having to guess at a setup. This is the milling that's going on for the second set of pieces that create the second board. And again, it's basically the same process all over again. So quite tedious. This whole process took approximately a month worth of my weekends. So, but it was really good to be able to get back in the shop and build something. I know all you've been bugging me about building stuff. So here I am. Now these are actually going to turn into actual boards at this point, not individual pieces. I'm gluing up pieces to make boards to then cut. So I'm getting closer to the point where things begin to look more like a cutting board. At this point, it just kind of seems like piecemeal. But now these ones are where you're demanding a little bit more out of the planer. I'm sending these through as whole pieces to flatten out. These again have to be perfect and at the exact same dimension for this to work. Now this is me adding my outrigger onto the sliding table, changing the blade to the crosscut blade, and then slicing off these pieces. The beauty of having these a crosscut like this is that I can take my rip fence, which you can kind of see off, pulled to the side. I can take that and use it as a stop and create all of these at the exact same width. And then these become the pieces to create the final glue up for the cutting boards. So those are all the pieces cut up. And then now I'm finally gluing up actual cutting boards. So as you go through this, you can kind of see off and to the left, the pattern is kind of created, the 3D pattern. As you're gluing up, you have to be really careful to keep lines straight. Otherwise, again, that effect doesn't work. So I'm going through, ensuring that each one is lined up right down the center, and then gluing up and getting off as much of the extra squeeze out glue as I possibly can, because I'm going to have to flatten these initially through the planer, and then after that through the double drum sander. So lots of glue up again going on right now. Okay, so here's a key learning. In the instructions, it said to put on sacrificial ends onto the board so you could run them through the planer and plane them like this. I don't know if I would do it that way the next time. I left out the wide drum sander, the double drum sander for this part. I'll show it at the end using it on a different cutting board. But I believe I would have just gone straight to the sander. After you get done with the double drum sander, you have to get out the scratch marks that are left over. And this is really hard wood, so it's not simple. It takes a bit of sanding initially to get all of those off. So I have another new toy I'm using right there, which is a vacuum clamp system that I can clamp the boards to, do my sanding, do the routing of the edges, before I have to actually process anything else. And I'm using it throughout the whole rest of the process to do the sanding. But I get the initial scratch marks out first and go through each one of those boards. And then when I'm finished, I'll end up routing some juice grooves in them. So we're going to let it play a little bit. Sanding was definitely the most tedious part of all of this. No getting around it. You got to sand these. It takes a lot to get them the way you want them to be. So it's just going to go on and on and on. And when we get through, you'll see I move on to the juice grooves here. And I created a little small jig and went back to the old school Porter cable router to make this happen. And then after those were done, now the real sanding comes to play. So now I'm to finish sanding, raising the grain with some water as I go through, and I have an Ecosand sander you can see I'm using right there, which is a 4x3 sander that goes up to 10,000 RPM, which is really great for polishing the parts of the wood that are harder to get to with just a regular random orbit sander. This was a progression of grits: 60, 80, 120, 150, 180, 220 by the time I was done. And after that, I had oiled them as I went through, and I started to actually put them together for shipping to my team. And this is me with my initial idea of how to ship a cutting board. And I haven't had anybody complain, so I'm assuming they came through scot free. So after I got through with those, my wife Sarah said, "Well, why don't you make some of those for the family too?" So here I am, making some more for the family. Different kind of a cutting board. These are Paduk and maple. The previous ones were Paduk, maple, and Sapele. And I actually prefer the Paduk. I think is a beautiful wood. So these are just a different kind of a geometric pattern, but it's hard to see from the video. But they vary in width, so it gives it a little bit more depth than just a regular checkerboard kind of a situation. Now this is what I left off of the first part. This is how I sand out and flatten the actual cutting boards. And this is a really good job of taking the stress out and making sure that they're really truly flat. And just a great machine. And now I get back to the tedious part of first getting the scratch marks out, then routing the juice groove, and then getting back to sanding the rest of them, and getting to a point where um, I can finish them also. Man, I got to come up with a better plan though for the juice groove because the amount of dust it left was pretty crazy. And finally on to oiling. Here's the boards originally with still the edges on, the sacrificial edges. That's after it's cut off. A little bit of water on there to see what it looked like. And the pattern came out great on these boards. Here's the first one after I've oiled it and then put some wax on it. And again, that's one of the final ones after it was finished. And there's the ones for my family that I'd made. And another one I just recently finished off that had been sitting in the garage for a bit. Thanks for being patient for videos. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you on the next one.